Welcome to the world of enzymes. Now you probably will be familiar with enzymes from previous years, and this little image here should remind you of some of the things you know about enzymes. You probably have come across them when you have thought about digestion. So you will be aware that as you eat things, you have to digest them, and digestion happens when enzymes attack them. So mostly you've been thinking about enzymes as molecules that take large, insoluble molecules like food molecules like starch and protein and fats, and you break them down into small soluble molecules. So this is something that also happens in washing powders or washing liquids, especially biological ones. They work because they have enzymes in them, and even at low temperatures those enzymes can catalyze those insoluble stain molecules being turned into soluble molecules that can be washed away. And this type of conversion from large to small when you're breaking things down is called a catabolic reaction or catabolism. And we will be dealing with catabolism, breaking things down, but we will also be dealing with anabolism. So anabolism is when a cell, like this one that you're familiar with, takes all those products of digestion, so amino acids, sugars, fatty acids and glycerol, and turns them into big molecules again, so proteins, big carbohydrates like starch, glycogen, cellulose, and lipids or fats. And when you build up molecules, that is anabolism. So you've probably heard of anabolic steroids, building things up. So when you take anabolism and catabolism together, you end up with all the reactions in the body, and that is what we call metabolism. So enzymes are involved in absolutely every single reaction that takes place in your body. Every single part of your metabolic pathways or metabolism is controlled by enzymes. So let's have a think about what is an enzyme. So an enzyme actually is a protein, and it is very important that its 3D shape is specific, and it has to be specific because there is a particular point on the enzyme called the active site, and that is where the reaction actually takes place. So the specific site shape fits into just one molecule of the substrate and allows the protein or the enzyme to do its job. And the sorts of enzymes that we're going to come across in HSC include digestive enzymes. So we'll meet one that's involved in digestion called renin in the stomach of mammals, amylase in the mouths of animals, catalase exists inside peroxisomes. We're also going to meet enzymes to do with DNA replication later on in year 12, things like DNA polymerase, enzymes to do with protein synthesis like mRNA polymerase. Enzymes, how do they work? Enzymes work if you think about a lock and a key. So the substrate slots into the enzyme just like a key fits into a lock. And the bit that it fits into there is the active site, a very specific part of the enzyme formed from the 3D structure of the enzyme. And then you get an enzyme substrate complex, so a temporary molecule, which is the substrate joined to the enzyme. This then breaks away, so we can remove this. This then breaks away and you end up with the product. So you might end up with a small piece at the top and a small piece at the bottom. So you end up with two products, and they will fall off the enzyme because they now no longer fit into the active site because they have been catalyzed. The reaction to break them apart has been catalyzed. And exactly the same thing would happen if you were joining things together. You'd have two substrates come in and one would leave. There is also a more up-to-date version of the model of enzyme action, and we have taken our lock and key idea and turned it into something called induced fit. And this is because our technology that we use to look at enzymes and model them has become more sophisticated over time. So because of the use of X-ray crystallography, NMR spectroscopy, and also large-scale computer modeling, we are able to think about the shape of enzymes and the shape of enzyme substrate complexes and actually come up with a slightly more sophisticated idea about how the substrate and the enzyme interact. And we think now it isn't so much a passive key fitting into a lock, it's more like the substrate comes in and the active site does its final shape shift, almost like giving the substrate a little bit of a hug, and the interaction between them becomes incredibly close, which kind of makes sense thinking about the complex shape of substrates. So there is a shifting in the shape of the enzyme as it binds to the substrate. It's inducing a fit around the substrate. But essentially, we still need an active site, and it still needs to be the perfect shape, so all of the things we've just talked about still hold true. So let's have a look at things that can increase the rate of enzyme action and decrease the rate of enzyme action. And the first thing we will think about is how to increase the rate of enzyme action. And here we have an image where if we take the substrate, so the thing that the enzyme is going to work on, and we give more of it to the enzyme, so we increase its concentration, then the rate of reaction gets faster. So more substrate, faster rates. And you can see in the first box here that when you haven't got very much substrate, the enzyme quickly processes it. So there's only one enzyme there with an actual substrate bound. Most of them are doing their job, they've already done it. At this point here, you get to a point where all of the active sites are actually saturated. So the enzyme is working as fast as it can, and there's just more substrate than it can cope with. So you end up with a maximum rate of reaction. So this is the fastest that the enzyme will ever be able to work. And for some enzymes like catalase, that's a huge number. That catalase can do 1 million reactions in a very short amount of time. So this is one way that we can increase the rate of enzyme reaction, is by giving the enzyme more to work on. But we're actually going to be considering how to slow down enzymes too. And if you take the temperature and we increase it a bit, you can make an enzyme go faster, but if you increase it too much, you can destroy enzymes. So the other way to destroy them is to give them the wrong pH. And when we talk about destroying enzymes, we talk about denaturing the active site. So a denatured active site, as you can see in this picture, is an active site whose shape has been morphed out of a perfect 3D specific shape for the substrate. So this means that the enzyme, which is denatured, now has an active site whose shape no longer fits the substrate. Even with an induced fit, it's not good enough. This means that there's no reaction going to take place, and it's usually a permanent change. And this is why it's really important that our bodies work hard to maintain a steady temperature that doesn't go too high, because we don't want to damage our enzymes irreparably. And it's why our kidneys work to maintain the pH of our bodies, so that the pH in our blood doesn't shift away from optimum, from the best that it should be. If we have a look at graphs of how the enzyme rate changes, as the temperature increases, the rate goes up. This is because the energy of all the molecules involved increases. Everything is bumping into each other much faster, so there's more collisions. But there comes a point where the bumping around and the jiggling of the enzyme is too great, and that is where denaturing of the enzyme starts to happen and the active site starts to change shape, and you can see a dramatic decrease in the activity of the enzyme, and eventually all of the active sites have changed beyond functioning. Now down here we have the effect of pH on the rate. And there are actually 3 enzymes on this graph. If we just focus on pepsin, pepsin is the enzyme in your stomach. You can see that it has a high rate of reaction between a very narrow range of pH. So it only really works in the high acidity level of your stomach. As soon as it moves from the stomach into the small intestine, it's going to stop working. And that is because the 3D shape of enzymes is maintained by different parts of the enzyme contacting each other, and bonds hold them in place. And when you change the pH, you introduce hydrogen ions into the solution. And those hydrogen ions can actually interfere with the bonding of the string of amino acids that make up the protein that is the enzyme. So as soon as you lose the bonds, the enzyme springs apart and you lose the shape of the active site, and then all of the activity is lost. Now, the last thing we're going to consider is inhibitors, and there are 3 types of inhibitor that we're going to consider in this graphic. The first picture on here is the normal situation. This is where an enzyme is interacting with its substrate and forming an enzyme-substrate complex. That's fine. That's what we would expect to see. In image B, there is a molecule mimicking the shape of the substrate. This is called a competitive inhibitor. It is competing for the active site. An example of something that might do this is the drug statins. Statins are used to lower people's cholesterol, and they act as a competitive inhibitor for an enzyme that helps to make cholesterol. That's how they work. They inhibit that enzyme from working. Now, down here we have an uncompetitive inhibitor. That means it's not binding directly to the active site, but it gets in the way of releasing the products. So the enzyme's substrate has bonded down here. The enzyme substrate is in place. We have an enzyme substrate complex, but the uncompetitive inhibitor is now getting in the way and the products can't be released. And that's really annoying. But we can utilize that. We can bring in some cancer drugs or some glaucoma drugs. Glaucoma is raised blood pressure in your eyeball. And those drugs actually interfere with enzymes and in a way that they help to get rid of cancer and get rid of glaucoma. And the last kind of inhibitor that we've got here is a non-competitive inhibitor. This is binding completely away from the active site. You can see it binding on the other side of the enzyme, but it has caused a massive change in the shape of the active site. And this is usually a permanent change. It binds and it sticks and it stays. And some nasty drugs that you will have heard of, for example, cyanide. That interferes with an important enzyme in your respiration, in your mitochondria, and a very small amount of it kills you. And penicillin. Penicillin doesn't affect you, but it affects the formation of cell walls in bacteria, which is why it's really useful to use to kill bacteria. It doesn't affect any of your enzymes, so it doesn't have any bad side effects for you if you're taking them. So those are our different types of inhibitor that can also reduce enzyme activity.